Yep, giving that timeout just before the snap. And he hits the upright again.
For as long as sports have existed, fans, players, and coaches alike have always had a rather tumultuous relationship with superstition. There's simply no denying that. Sure, there are the secular folks who think that the outcome of a game is determined solely by what takes place between the lines, but for the most part, superstition has always played a big role in the culture around sports. Where it gets really interesting, however, is when you take a closer look at some of these so-called superstitions and try to draw the line between luck and strategy, because some of them really bridge the gap between the two concepts. There is no more poignant of an example of this than icing the kicker in football, the term for when an opposing coach calls a timeout as late as they possibly can before a kicker takes an important field goal attempt, with the intent of throwing the kicker out of the routine and thus increasing the chance that they miss the kick. For being such a relatively niche play, it has strangely become one of the most recognizable terms in all of sports. Ice the kicker. It means something to pretty much anyone who has watched even the slightest bit of football in their life. The tradition, or strategy, or whatever you want to call it, has been around for as long as field goals have been kicked in the NFL. But the modern version of icing, in which the coach waits until the absolute last possible second to get the timeout called in from the sideline, has been a much more recent advent. In fact, it's thought to have originated at the NFL level with the legendary head coach Mike Shanahan. It has been hypothesized that he developed the tactic from speaking with one of his friends, Sonny Lubick, who coached at the college ranks in Colorado State, and had successfully iced an opposing kicker the year before. Shanahan then brought the move to the NFL when his Denver Broncos were playing the then Oakland Raiders, and their kicker, Sebastian Janikowski, was lining up for a game-winning field goal. Shanahan positioned himself right up next to one of the line's judges on the sideline and told him that he was going to call a timeout. The longtime coach patiently waited for the last possible second, watching Janikowski through his entire pre-kick routine, and then, once the kicker lifted his head up for the snap, he called for a timeout. By the time word got from the sideline official to the field that a timeout had been called, the kick had already been launched, and it was good. But after the officials gathered and the initial shock had worn off, the crew decided that they had to award Shanahan the timeout because he had gotten the message to an official before the ball was snapped. So the kick was eventually waved off, which probably wouldn't have been a huge deal, nor would it have made the waves around the NFL that it did had the subsequent kick not bounced off the upright. And because the NFL is a massive copycat league, this became the trendy thing for coaches to do, and it has stuck pretty much ever since. But does deploying these kinds of tactics actually give the icing team an advantage? Or is it just more of an old-fashioned superstition for a coach to try and take an opposing kicker out of rhythm with a timeout? Maybe it's reactionary for the coach's fear that if they don't ice the kicker and the guy drills the field goal, that the coach will then be ridiculed in the media. Or when it comes down to it, maybe icing the kicker is simply just a roll of the dice. Let's take a closer look at the origin of this phenomenon, some famous anecdotes from NFL history, and some of the key statistics around the play, to see if we can settle on whether or not icing the kicker actually does anything. Now, before we get started, it is worth acknowledging that there are varying schools of thought as to exactly how effective this really is, and the picture is still a little bit murky, as there are a couple of conflicting studies. So what better place to start than by checking out the man who is widely considered to be the greatest kicker of all time, Adam Vinatieri. The four-time Super Bowl champion and three-time All-Pro selection was interviewed by the New York Times, and he had his own thoughts on whether or not icing, which gained widespread popularity during his career, actually works. "I don't think it's that big of a deal," Vinatieri said, after being asked about some of the last-second timeouts that were rattling his peers around the league. "We have to be able to reload and do it again. Anything that makes it easier for kickers, I'm all for, but I don't think changing that rule is gonna help." But just because the greatest kicker of all time is comfortable with opposing coaches trying to ice him, it doesn't mean that everyone is going to be all honky-dory with it. One of his colleagues, Jay Feely, did not take as kindly to the tactic, going as far as arguing that perhaps the play should be outlawed entirely. "I understand the strategy," Feely said. "At the same time, there are a lot of plays that the NFL has outlawed because they say it's deceptive in nature. I think this falls under that same category. It's deceptive." Sounds like some pretty convenient complaining from a guy who ended up on the wrong side of an icing a couple of times in his career, but what do I know? Since we have conflicting testimony from these two well-known NFL kickers, how about we jump into the numbers? There have been a few different individuals who have taken it upon themselves to take a look at the stats behind icing the kicker. Scott Berry, a statistician and former chairman of the Statistics and Sports section of the American Statistical Association, studied every field goal attempt made in the 2002 and 2003 seasons. He concluded that icing the kicker probably had a correlation with kickers missing important kicks, but that it was most effective on kicks that were more difficult. For example, in the range of 40 to 55 yards. At those distances, when a timeout is called, the probability of the kicker making the attempt drops about 10%. So if a kicker is usually successful on those kicks 75% of the time, icing might mean he's successful just 65% of the time. Keep in mind, this was back in 2002 and 2003, back when this trend was first starting to make the rounds in the NFL. Fortunately, Sharp Football Analysis did a similar study in 2020, which examined NFL games from the previous 5 seasons, 2014 through 2018. And just like Berry's studies, Sharp also hypothesized as to what the actual impact icing the kicker has at the NFL level. Because the Sharp Football Analysis study was a little bit more intricate, let's review some of their ground rules real quick. They only counted the instances in which the coach called a timeout with the sole intent to ice the kicker. There were many cases in which a timeout preceded a field goal to stop the clock or for various strategic purposes, and those were excluded from the study, leaving 145 instances over the 5-year span. Out of the 145 icing attempts, 85 of them came in the first half, meaning that just over 41% of them came in the fourth quarter or overtime. Sharp Football Analysis suspected that this was the case because coaches were more inclined to use their timeouts in the first half when the ability to stop the clock wasn't as critical. But perhaps coaches should be more willing to pony up and use those timeouts to ice the kicker in situations where points are a more valuable commodity than time, because the numbers that Sharp came back with are telling. Every year, the field goal percentage in iced clutch kicks was lower than that of a non-iced clutch kick. The closest gap came in 2015 at 8.1%, and the largest came in the next season in 2016 when the gap was at 17.9%. The split for the 4-year average sits at 12.8%. Interestingly, the impact on the kicker may not be entirely psychological either. Explained Graham Gano, another longtime NFL kicker. If you take a practice kick, chances are you will not get that same ball back to kick again, said Gano. Usually, the first ball is the better ball. Kickers don't get to break the balls in for weeks like quarterbacks. They are brand new before the game, and our K-ball guy gets 45 minutes to break them in. So a good ball is very important. So I've gone away from taking the first rep as a practice kick. As with most things in sports, the success of icing the kicker is largely situational, but it does have an impact. It's all about finding the best way to utilize the strategy, which, according to the numbers, is at a pivotal moment in the game when the kick is at distance. NFL kickers today are too good to be thrown off their game on a short kick. And yes, there will always be the Adam Vinatieris and Justin Tuckers of the world who are not rattled by anything. So maybe, if you're squaring up with a team that has an elite kicker, don't waste your timeouts and just hope you caught them on a bad day. But for the rest of the kickers around the league, whose performance level seems to be a bit more of a crapshoot, no harm in turning the pressure up by icing them and seeing what happens. Do you think the NFL should ban icing the kicker? Join us in the comment section below. If you liked this video and learned a thing or two, clicking the like button helps out a ton, and hey, we appreciate it. If this is your first time coming around to TPS though, subscribing is a great idea, because we put out videos like this every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.